Hello and welcome back for another episode of this season of Try This on Wisp Sports. I'm your host, Dr. Kirstin Lauritzen, and today we are going to skip our normal pre-episode how's training going scenario, and we are going to dive right into our main topic of the day. Last week, we talked about preparing for your next training block or cycle, and the things that I talked about, the points that I really wanted to focus on and mention and get across is that there are some standard things that you want to test for before you go into training so that you can make sure that things like inflammation are down, making sure that your vitamins and minerals and antioxidants are up, and that your body has what it needs to head into that training session or season or cycle, that like an 8 to 12 week cycle, right? And the point of that is that as the body then gets into that training cycle, that then you can allow the body to mop up the inflammation that happens in that training cycle pretty much on its own without needing to do a lot of other things or interventions. And it's actually at that point that we really want to try not to put in a bunch of antioxidants and supplements and things like that. So this is actually where the like standard multivitamin in many ways can actually work against you. And then also there are just so many supplement companies now that tailor all their supplements to athletes. And so then you'll see like the whey protein then has like basically a multivitamin in it, and they're taking that after every single workout. That actually in many ways could be working against you. So the reason to make sure that you have some of these areas taken care of before you head into a training block is so that your body is ready to go and prepared. The other thing that I didn't mention also in the previous episode is that things like vitamin D, for example, like there are certain types of vitamins and minerals that we actually want to make sure are at adequate levels. For example, vitamin D, because not only is it really good for your immune system, but it also can prevent injuries. It actually can reduce a risk of injuries, which is super interesting. So there are just things like that you want to dial in and make sure that you have enough of so that as you head into your next training block, like you're ready to go and you're pretty much, at the lowest risk of having any types of illnesses or injuries that may take you out of training, or the worst case scenario, take you out of competing. So what I did say, though, that we were going to talk about today in the next episode is that there is a point when you get through those adaptations to exercise and you can start to notice a bit of a plateau in your training. This is something that is normal and that a lot of athletes see. There's a point where you can kind of get to an area where you may be overreaching. What that tends to look like is maybe some random symptoms have started popping up that you haven't had before. Could be as random as not sleeping very well or noticing that you're waking up a little bit more at night, multiple times a night. Could be symptoms like your weird allergies have started to pop up, or maybe some weird like itchy skin or some type of something strange, right? Like that. That's just not normal. Other things could be just kind of general fatigue, could be some niggles, some aches and pains, some weird type of stuff that's popping up that's not normal. Could be, and this is all in the context of you've just recently seen that your performance has plateaued, meaning that you're not necessarily seeing that increase in those training performance gains. You've kind of leveled out a little bit at your new level, I guess I would say. So it's at that time that if you start noticing some of these symptoms start to pop up, might be a good thing to kind of look and see if this is a time where you may be overreaching. And this is why there's, I have athletes test their resting heart rate. I have them test their heart rate variability and also their sleep, and make sure that they kind of keep that on tabs, because some of those things can actually tell us if there's an issue that they're headed into overtraining or overreaching. And that's the time when we make certain interventions in order to help make sure that they don't go into overtraining. And I'm going to dive into this as a second portion of this, because then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about what that looks like as a whole. But the reason why I want to go into overtraining right now is because if overreaching turns into overtraining, what essentially happens is, and I want you to picture this scenario with an athlete, okay? So we've seen these adaptations to exercise, things are starting to plateau. So they're not necessarily noticing increases in, like, let's say if they're a weightlifter, they're not necessarily seeing any improvements or those numbers going up. Let's say they're an endurance athlete, they're not necessarily seeing power and speed and time improvements. Stuff like that is where you might notice a plateau. So then they start to notice, like, now things really aren't quite going right. I'm feeling a little bit more fatigued. Things feel a little bit off. And it's usually at this point where athletes think that they need to be doing more, right? So this is oftentimes when athletes will start to maybe add in an extra workout, or maybe they'll start to try to increase the intensity of the types of workouts that they're doing. They'll try to do all sorts of different things, maybe train more often. There's a lot of different types of corrections that athletes try to make that they think is going to lead to, them starting to see it turn around and improve. But when they make those choices of, I need to train more in order to see the outcome that I want to see, which is performance gains, some of the symptoms of overtraining can look like that decreased performance that I was just talking about. Also, an increased perceived effort during workouts. So that's like, it seems like it's harder to reach the level that they should be at, or where they think they should be at, than it seemed to be, before this, right? Excessive fatigue, or just like an extreme amount of fatigue. Anything that's interrupting sleep, could be restless sleep, could be insomnia, could be waking up multiple times a night, could be all sorts of different things when it comes to sleep. So any type of sleep disturbance, any type of changes in emotion. So like irritability is one, or like moodiness in general is another, that just like, there's emotions just aren't quite stable, and noticing that you're kind of like riding that wave or that train. Things like, even like a loss of appetite sometimes can be a sign of overtraining. Also things like nagging injuries, heavy leg muscles, feeling like you're just not able to train at the level that you used to be able to. And also noticing things like performance plateaus, declines, things like that. Those are all symptoms that if you allow this process to go on for too long, instead of actually having athletes rest, what tends to happen is athletes tend to work harder. And so then they just work themselves into this issue. And then that's when we often see things like athletes spending lots of time out of training sick. We see things like injuries and just these chronic things that keep coming back. And it just is this decline that is really, really hard on both an athlete's mental standpoint and mental health when it comes to performance, but it's also really hard on their body too. So now that we've laid all of that out, the key is to figure out if an athlete is starting to plateau in their performance, and if they're starting to notice changes in their resting heart rate and their heart rate variability. Also, if they take labs at this time and they notice some changes in C-reactive protein and ferritin, so iron, that is a very critical time to intervene at that point. So what I mean by that is, it's at this time that things like rest, certain types of anti-inflammatories or antioxidants are all going to be what you want to introduce at that time to then help the athlete turn the train around. And instead of continuing on at that performance plateau, what we actually see happen is they increase their training. So they almost like rebound in a sense. And as I said, what I'm talking about, you can look up a map of Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome. This is what all of this is based off of, and you can just look that up on Google and it'll pull all of this up in a really great chart and map. but you can basically fuss with how an athlete goes through this process by, number one, going back to the previous episode, making sure that the athlete is ready to go and knows that their, antioxidants, anti-inflammatories, all those types of things are, all their multivitamin, mineral, all those, everything that we talk about. There are some very key things that we can make sure are exactly where we want them to be before an athlete heads into a training block. And then they go through that adaptation phase. They go through their, plateau. We catch them at the right time at that overtraining spot, and then we take them on up. So that's essentially what this would look like. So we're going to talk about this more. We're actually going to talk about chronic inflammation and like what happens if an athlete has inflammation as they head into a training block, and how do you manage that and what do you do? We're going to talk about all of that right after this short break. So let's say, as we are looking at an athlete and let's say they have high C-reactive protein, high CRP on their labs that they just got run by their doctor. If we're starting out a training block at that time, or like, let's say an athlete comes in the middle of their training block and we get that lab back and they notice that, or we notice that their CRP is high, so they're highly inflamed, and we're not sure, well, we want to make sure that we tackle what's going on there, right? If that athlete is inflamed at that point in time, there's no reason to work harder with the body, like to make the body work harder. It's okay to add in antioxidants at that time, because the point of antioxidants and anti-inflammatories is that they help the body to mop up inflammation. But the problem when it comes to exercise and training is that we want the body to absorb that training. We want it to adapt, but it's not going to adapt and absorb that training if the inflammation is so high that the body can't do anything about it. And now, instead of it being a positive thing, it's now turning into more and more chronic stress. This is where, when I have an athlete, especially a higher level athlete, come in and they have chronic illnesses or chronic pain, it's a very fine line that we walk, because we want to make sure that they are healthy and we want to make sure that they are able to continue training. But if the inflammation and load on the body is so high that it's causing chronic pain or chronic illnesses of some type, we really need to take a step back and make sure that we're addressing the issue before we just continue to load more stress on the body and then potentially cause that athlete to not be able to perform and not be able to continue on in their sport. And I've seen it happen over and over and over again. So it's an important thing to talk about and to address, because I know that this isn't just your pro and elite athletes. This is also our age groupers. This is our everyday, everyday athletes, just like you and me. So when it comes to chronic inflammation, this is a question I get asked all the time. What do I need to be looking for, and what are some of the things that I can be doing? Well, first off, when it comes to how do you know if you have inflammation? So if we're still kind of talking about the pre-cycle, pre-training block, or if we're looking midway through and we're seeing that performance markers aren't where they should be, there's lots of like weird symptoms that are popping up, and there's clearly just an extreme amount of load on that athlete's body. A couple of different ways that we look for inflammation are things like C-reactive protein, as I mentioned. It's a lab that it's something you can get run with a standard lab from your primary care physician. Very easy to get run. Another way that you can look for inflammation is to get a urine organic acid test, which essentially tests all these different types of markers that if you are dealing with a lot of inflammation, it can show that there are some of those basically byproducts show up in the urine. And so then we can look at it that way. But the other thing that you can do as well is look at your omega-3 to omega-6 ratios and status. And if you have a omega-3 to omega-6 ratio that's out of balance, then you may also be dealing with inflammation there. And that takes that a step further. If it is out of balance, it's possible that there are some parts of these omegas, these fatty acids, that are causing inflammation, but they also have, at the right levels, are able to mop up inflammation. In fact, they can actually turn some of the switches for inflammation off in the body. But you have to make sure that they are at the right level. You have to make sure that you're taking the right amount, because if you take too much of some of them, they can actually turn to be pro-inflammatory. So, not to complicate things, but that does bring us back to the point of, this is why we test when we have goals and things in mind that are a really big deal, and we want to make sure that we are going to get it right. So that's 3 different ways that you can test for inflammation. Some other things that you can look at is your CBC and Chem panel, which we talked about in the previous episode. Those are standard labs that you can get. You can ask them for things like ferritin and vitamin D, just to make sure that your iron levels are appropriate, your vitamin D levels are appropriate. And then there's some other areas in those labs that we can see if you have higher levels of inflammation. So those are just standard great labs to start out with. There's many different options out there if you don't have access to a primary care physician, but those are some different ways to start looking to see if you do have inflammation. The other thing that I will note on that, because this always comes back to me, is these labs will test inflammation from the possibility that there are sources of inflammation from different ways. But I think, as I mentioned in the past episode as well, is that C-reactive protein, or CRP, is it's a marker of a certain type of cytokine called interleukin 6. IL-6 is how you'll see it written. It's pretty much only a marker or derivative of that one. But there are tons of different types of interleukins and cytokines, some that are anti-inflammatory, some that are pro-inflammatory. So here is what happens often. I will say a patient has inflammation, okay? They then go to their doctor, another doctor, and they say, well, so-and-so, Dr. K, said that I have inflammation. And then that doctor will proceed to run a C-reactive protein, or CRP test. And then they'll say, well, your inflammation levels are low because they're, between 0 and 5. And so then that athlete comes back, or that person comes back to me, and they're like, well, this is what my other doctor said. And that's when I have to explain that these labs, and so CRP is only one marker of a certain subset of different types of inflammatory markers. It doesn't encompass all of them. And if you have symptoms like brain fog, if you have symptoms like difficulty focusing, or systemic like joint pain, so in multiple joints around your body, you have joint pain. Arthritis is another condition that is an inflammatory condition. Anything that is autoimmune is an inflammatory situation for the body. If you have gut bloating, if you are sick often, if you have really painful menstrual cycles or periods or cramps, like super inflammatory, that's super inflammatory. There's many different things that go on in the body that are signs that the body is dealing with inflammation, but they don't always show up on a lab when you look specifically for something like CRP. Okay. So what we need to do is we need to recognize that there are symptoms that are signs that the body is under load and it's handling inflammation. And we also need to recognize that there are labs that we run so that we can get a good picture of what's going on in the body. But just because a lab doesn't say what you're experiencing doesn't mean that what you're experiencing isn't actually happening. So what are some of the things that we can do if you have signs of like chronic inflammation, right? First off, looking at what the food that you eat is a really critical place to start. So things like organic produce in the areas where the certain types of produce is exposed to pesticides and things like that. That's one really good switch. Another thing is making sure that you're more often than not choosing quality meats, quality protein. So trying to get grass-fed beef, and also that's grass-finished. If you can get it from a local farm, that's even better. If you can do actually like pasture-raised chicken, again, maybe going to a local farm is a good option here. But making choices like that when you can have a significant impact on how your body deals with training, also with how it deals with inflammation. Antioxidants, as I mentioned, is another one where we can really help reduce inflammation. But as I said, if an athlete has high inflammation and they're in the middle of their training cycle, putting in antioxidants and anti-inflammatories at that time is fine to do, because they're not going to be absorbing that training anyway. But if an athlete is doing pretty well and we just happen to be running a lab at that time, it's not going to be the best time to put antioxidants or anti-inflammatories in. Other things are watching sugar intake. So just making sure that we're not sending your blood sugar for a loop-de-loop all day long and just spiking and dropping and spiking and dropping. A little more protein in there and trying to not spike our blood sugar all day long is another way to help reduce inflammation. As I mentioned as well from the testing, omega-3s and omega-6s, those are all a good way to help reduce inflammation when they're at the right levels. And then there's also things like sleep, which are good, and eating enough food for the amount of output that you are putting out into, like, you're using up a lot of calories, right? So eating enough food is a really good thing. And then also there's like deep breathing and meditation that can help to stimulate what's called the vagus nerve, which is very helpful for rest and relaxation and helping with sleep and helping your gut function well. So there's many different areas there that we can work on to help with chronic inflammation. There are other things as well that I didn't mention, but those are very well researched ways that you can work on reducing inflammation if you run a panel and see that inflammation is something that might be something you need to work on, or if you have some signs and symptoms that there are problems. But as you can see out of this episode and the previous episode, there are quite a few things that you can be doing in a training block to really optimize how you perform and how you use and get the most out of that training that you're doing, which I think is critical, right? And as I have said, I think throughout this whole podcast, this is also the way that we help to keep our athletes healthy and also performing well. And I think that's a very critical thing for when we look at longevity in sport, and also for really pushing the body to get those best performance markers that we can, and really trying to meet that potential that I know that a lot of you have. And so how do we unlock that? Part of that is by looking at this and making sure that you are doing the right things at the right time in those training blocks. And then the last thing that I will say, because I know that I've said this in both episodes, yes, multivitamins and multiminerals are essential for everyday normal life. But when you use them, when you're trying to get a specific outcome from the body, when we're trying to get it to adapt, it's just the wrong time to use them. So keep that in mind, keep them on hand, take them when you're not in a specific training block. But when you know you're in, like, for example, for me, I have December 5th is my Palm Springs, Indian Wells half Ironman. I am right now in a training block. So we're doing all the things to try to get the most out of the training that I'm doing. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. I think that's the episode for now. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to follow Wisp Sports on all social media channels. And also, I would love it if you would share this episode with someone that you think might find it really helpful. It's also really great if you can help us out and write a review for the show and mark it with stars and hopefully a 5 stars if you've been listening to it for this long. It really helps us get this episode out to more people and gets this podcast out to more people. You can also follow me at Dr. Kirstin on Facebook and Instagram, and you can also find me at drkirstin.com. If you'd like to reach us with any comments or questions about this episode, you can at info@wispsports.com. And you can always leave a direct message with us over on social media as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be back next week. Take care.